Single dad uses his secret skill to rescue CEO's child from kidnappers. She changed his life forever. 3:47 a.m. Rocky Mountain Wilderness. Jake Mitchell's calloused fingers pressed into the frozen earth as he belly crawled through pine needles and dead leaves. 4 years of fixing engines had softened his hands, but muscle memory from Afghanistan came flooding back. Mud and ash streaked his weathered face like forgotten war paint. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, reaching for the emergency inhaler he kept in his first aid kit while mentally calculating respiratory rates and oxygen saturation. The woman watched with the desperate attention of someone whose world had narrowed to the rise and fall of her child's chest. Years in Afghanistan had taught Jake that panic was contagious, that steady hands and a calmer voice could mean the difference between life and death in situations where seconds stretched like hours. The inhaler worked its chemical magic, color returning to Ryan's cheeks as his breathing gradually steadied into something approaching normal rhythm. The woman's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Jake caught her elbow with the same gentle strength he used when Emma woke from nightmares about losing her only remaining parent. "He's going to be fine," Jake assured her, noting how her expensive watch caught the afternoon light and how her hands still shook despite her son's improvement. "But you should definitely get him checked by a doctor when you get back to town. Altitude changes can trigger attacks, even in kids who don't usually have problems." She nodded, tears threatening to spill over as the immediate crisis passed, leaving room for other fears to surface. This wasn't a woman accustomed to helplessness, which made her current vulnerability all the more striking to someone trained to read people under stress. While they waited for the tow truck Jake had called, Ryan explored the garage with the resilient curiosity that seemed hardwired into children who'd already survived more than their share of adult problems. He peppered Jake with questions about every tool, every car part, every photograph of Emma that decorated the workspace like shrines to normalcy. "Is that your little girl?" Ryan asked, pointing to a photo of Emma missing her front teeth at last year's school carnival. "Her name's Emma," Jake replied, watching the boy's face light up with interest. "She's 8, and she asks about as many questions as you do." The woman, who'd introduced herself as Victoria while carefully avoiding any mention of a last name, paid the tow truck driver in cash, politely declining to provide contact information or credit card details. Jake filed these details away with the automatic precision of someone who'd learned to notice patterns that others missed. As Victoria's damaged Honda was loaded onto the truck bed, she turned back to Jake with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper, more desperate. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who hadn't experienced genuine kindness in months. Ryan hasn't had anyone show him this kind of attention since. She paused, seeming to catch herself before revealing too much. "Since his father died," she finished, the words carrying the rehearsed quality of a story told too many times. Ryan looked up at Jake with the hero worship that reminded him painfully of how Emma used to look at him before Afghanistan taught him that heroes were just ordinary people who happened to survive their worst decisions. "Will we see you again?" the boy asked with the directness that adults had forgotten how to manage. Jake glanced at Victoria, reading permission in her slight nod. "Cedar Falls is a small town," he said. "I have a feeling we'll run into each other." That evening, Jake picked up Emma from her after-school program at Cedar Falls Elementary, her enthusiastic chatter about art projects and playground politics filling his pickup truck like music. She was his anchor in ways she'd never fully understand, the reason he got up every morning and pretended the weight of his military service didn't sometimes threaten to crush him under its accumulated memories. As they drove through downtown's 4-block commercial district, Emma pressed her face to the passenger window with sudden excitement. "Daddy, look, it's the pretty lady and the boy from your garage." Victoria and Ryan were emerging from Murphy's General Store, she carrying grocery bags while he skipped beside her with animated gestures that suggested their afternoon had improved considerably. "Can we say hi?" Emma asked, already unbuckling her seatbelt. The cracked military compass dangling from his belt caught moonlight as he paused, studying fresh tire treads carved deep into mountain soil. 50 yards ahead, yellow light leaked from an abandoned mining cabin's broken windows. Through military-grade binoculars salvaged from his garage, 2 armed shadows paced inside while a child's broken sobs pierced the mountain silence. Jake's breath formed white clouds in the bitter cold as he checked his phone one last time. Jake found himself pulling into a parking space, drawn by curiosity and something else he couldn't quite name. The introductions were easy in the way that small-town encounters often were, Emma's natural friendliness breaking through Ryan's initial shyness within minutes. Victoria seemed different outside the crisis atmosphere of the garage, more relaxed despite the way her eyes continued to catalog faces and license plates with unconscious vigilance. "Emma's daddy fixed my breathing," Ryan announced proudly, as if Jake's medical intervention had been a personal gift rather than basic human decency. "And he has the coolest tools in his garage, and he knows how to fix everything that's broken." Emma immediately launched into her own catalog of her father's capabilities, creating a competition of praise that made both adults smile despite their respective worries. Jake found himself studying Victoria's face when she thought no one was looking, noting the tension that never quite left her shoulders and the way she positioned herself to maintain sight lines to multiple escape routes. Over the following week, Jake encountered Victoria and Ryan with increasing frequency around Cedar Falls, their paths crossing at the coffee shop where he read his morning paper, the park where Emma played after school, and the small grocery store that served the entire mountain community. They'd rented a cabin on Pine Ridge Road, the kind of isolated property that people chose when they wanted to disappear for a while. Ryan and Emma developed the instant friendship that children managed with enviable ease, their laughter echoing across playgrounds and filling quiet moments with the promise that good things could still happen unexpectedly. Victoria seemed to relax incrementally in Jake's presence, though she never quite lost the hypervigilance that marked her as someone who'd learned to expect danger from unexpected directions. During a chance encounter at Sarah's old favorite coffee shop, Victoria mentioned that her husband had passed away recently in a tone that suggested the subject was both painful and closed to further discussion. Jake recognized the careful phrasing of someone who'd rehearsed their story until it felt almost true, understanding better than most that some truths weren't ready for daylight. He shared his own edited history in return, talking about Sarah's battle with cancer and his decision to leave his previous career to focus on single parenthood. He didn't mention Afghanistan, the nightmares that still woke him some nights, or the reason he kept emergency supplies cached throughout his property in patterns that would have made his old commanding officer proud. "It's hard," Victoria said quietly, watching their children chase each other around the playground, starting over when everything you thought you knew about your life turns out to be wrong. Their conversation was interrupted by Ryan's enthusiastic request for Jake to teach him how to skip stones at the small lake behind the coffee shop. As they walked to the water's edge, Jake noticed how Victoria's attention never fully settled, her gaze constantly moving across their surroundings like a sentry on patrol. She cataloged faces, memorized license plates, and positioned herself to maintain clear sightlines to multiple exits with the unconscious efficiency of someone who'd been hunted. Jake's own threat assessment instincts, dormant for years but never truly extinct, began picking up anomalies around their small town that he couldn't articulate but definitely couldn't ignore. The black sedan that appeared in different locations with different drivers but the same government-issued license plates. The stranger at Murphy's store asking casual questions about new residents, claiming to represent an insurance company that didn't exist when Jake looked it up later. 18 hours since they'd taken the boy. His thumb hovered over the emergency contact before activating his old military headset with trembling precision. Ghost 7 to base. Package located. 2 tangos confirmed. Initiating final approach. The words tasted like copper and old memories. Jake Mitchell had sworn he'd never be a soldier again, but tonight, some stranger's terrified child was about to learn that fathers never really stop fighting. Small details that might mean nothing individually but created a pattern that set off alarm bells trained into him through years of survival in hostile territory. Jake started varying his daily routines in ways that felt natural but provided tactical advantages, taking different routes to Emma's school and work, checking mirrors more frequently, and ensuring his emergency preparations remained current and accessible. He told himself he was being paranoid, that civilian life had made him soft and suspicious, but 20 years of staying alive in dangerous places had taught him to trust his instincts even when logic argued against them, especially when those instincts were protecting more than just his own life. One evening, while Emma and Ryan played in Jake's backyard under the golden light of early autumn, Victoria helped him prepare dinner with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in his kitchen. She moved around the space like she'd been there for years, seasoning pasta sauce with confident touches and asking about Emma's favorite foods with genuine maternal interest. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to have this kind of companionship again, this sense of shared responsibility and quiet domesticity that he'd missed more than he cared to admit. The children's laughter drifted through the open windows while Victoria hummed softly under her breath, creating a scene of normalcy that felt almost too good to be real, which, as it turned out, it was. Victoria's phone buzzed during dinner preparation, its generic ringtone cutting through their comfortable conversation like a knife. She glanced at the screen and went pale, excusing herself to take the call in private with apologies that didn't quite mask her sudden panic. Through the kitchen window, Jake watched her pace his driveway while speaking in hushed, urgent tones, her free hand gesturing frantically as her carefully maintained composure crumbled. When she returned minutes later, her hands were visibly shaking, and she made immediate excuses about Ryan needing to get home for bedtime. The transformation from relaxed to terrified happened so quickly that Jake's combat-trained instincts kicked into high alert, his eyes automatically scanning for threats while his mind began calculating defensive positions and escape routes. That night, sleep eluded Jake completely. Something about Victoria's panic had triggered his hypervigilance, activating neural pathways that years of therapy had helped him manage but never fully eliminate. He found himself moving through his house in patrol patterns, checking locks and sight lines, ensuring his emergency supplies were accessible and his defensive preparations were current. Emma slept peacefully in her room, surrounded by stuffed animals and artwork that spoke of childhood innocence and security, blissfully unaware that her father was sitting in the living room darkness with a loaded pistol within easy reach. The old fears had returned with familiar weight, the certainty that safety was temporary, that violence could erupt without warning, that the people he loved were always one mistake away from becoming casualties of his past. Dawn brought the worst phone call of Jake's life since the morning a military chaplain had appeared at his door to deliver news about casualties from his last mission. Victoria's voice was barely recognizable, high and thin with a panic that cut through static and distance like broken glass. "They took him," she whispered, each word a struggle against tears and terror. "They took Ryan. There's a note. They want me to come alone to the old mining site up Bear Creek Canyon. If I bring anyone else, if I call the police." Her voice broke completely, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and Jake's world shifting on its axis. The safe, quiet life he'd built in Cedar Falls suddenly felt as fragile as paper in a hurricane. Jake's military training engaged immediately, his voice dropping to the calm, authoritative tone he'd used to coordinate medical evacuations under enemy fire. "Victoria, listen to me carefully. You're not going alone, and we're going to get Ryan back safely." 48 hours earlier, autumn in Cedar Falls had painted Main Street in shades of gold and crimson. Jake wiped engine grease from his weathered hands with a red shop rag, the familiar scent of motor oil and fresh coffee filling Mitchell's auto repair. At 35, he'd carefully constructed a quiet life from the wreckage of his past, each day a deliberate choice to move forward rather than look back. "I need you to tell me exactly what the note says, word for word, and then I need you to trust me like you've never trusted anyone in your life." She read the demands through tears that he could hear in every syllable. Victoria was to come to the abandoned Bear Creek mining operation, at dawn, alone, bringing some kind of evidence or documents that Jake didn't understand but that clearly terrorized her. Any sign of law enforcement or backup would result in Ryan's immediate execution. As she spoke, Jake was already moving through his house with purposeful efficiency, retrieving gear he'd hoped never to need again. The tactical vest hidden behind winter coats in his bedroom closet still fit perfectly, its familiar weight settling onto his shoulders like an old friend returning from a long journey. Night vision equipment wrapped in Emma's old baby blankets, encrypted radio gear disguised as amateur radio hobby equipment, weapons and ammunition stored in configurations that looked innocent to casual inspection, but provided immediate access to someone who knew where to look. His hands moved with automatic precision while his mind calculated distances, approach routes, and contingency plans for every scenario he could imagine. "Victoria, where are you right now? Are you safe?" She was at the cabin, alone and terrified, barricaded behind locked doors while shadows moved outside her windows and every sound might herald her son's death. Jake's first call was to his old team leader, Wolf, who ran a private security consulting firm in Colorado Springs and owed Jake more favors than either of them could count. Wolf's voice carried the same steady calm that had gotten their unit through impossible situations in Afghanistan, promising to be airborne within the hour with backup personnel and specialized equipment. "Go 7, you sure about this? Civilian hostage rescue isn't exactly our current specialty." Jake paused in his equipment check, thinking about Ryan's terrified eyes and Emma's peaceful sleep upstairs. "Some things don't change, Wolf. And some fights choose you whether you want them or not." The line went quiet for a moment before Wolf's acknowledgement came through with the weight of shared history and unbreakable bonds forged in combat. The drive to Victoria's cabin took 23 minutes through mountain roads that Jake had memorized during weeks of unconscious reconnaissance, his mind automatically cataloging defensive positions and escape routes, while his heart hammered against his ribs with anticipation and fear. He found Victoria sitting on her front steps, clutching a manila envelope like a lifeline and staring at nothing with the hollow eyes of someone whose world had just collapsed. When she saw Jake approaching in full tactical gear, something between relief and terror crossed her face, as if she couldn't decide whether salvation or additional danger had just arrived. "You're really going to try to get him back," she said, her voice carrying the wonder of someone who'd forgotten that help could arrive without conditions or price tags attached. Jake knelt in front of her on the wooden steps, taking her trembling hands in his calloused ones with surprising gentleness. The envelope between them felt heavy with secrets and consequences, its contents representing something important enough to kill for and die over. "Victoria, I'm going to bring Ryan home safely, but I need you to tell me everything. No more edited versions or careful omissions. Who are these people? What's in that envelope? What haven't you told me about your situation?" Her story emerged in broken pieces, truth spilling out like water through a cracked dam under pressure that had built for months of running and hiding and pretending that normal life was possible for someone with her particular set of problems. She wasn't just any single mother fleeing a bad marriage. She was Victoria Sterling, CEO of TechVault Industries, a cybersecurity firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars and currently locked in a vicious custody battle with her ex-husband. The bell above his shop door chimed with the lazy rhythm of small-town life, interrupting his debate about whether to tackle Mrs. Henderson's stubborn transmission or surrender to the autumn afternoon. Sarah had been gone 2 years now, cancer claiming her with the same relentless efficiency that had once defined his military missions. But Emma, his 8-year-old daughter with gap-toothed grins and boundless curiosity, made every sunrise worth the fight against his own darkness. Alex Sterling controlled enough judges and politicians to make legal victory impossible, possessed connections to organized crime that made threats real and immediate, and had demonstrated his willingness to destroy anyone who stood between him and what he considered his property. The envelope contained evidence of Alex's money laundering operations, his facilitation of human trafficking networks, and his systematic elimination of business partners who'd threatened to expose his criminal activities. Victoria had stolen the documents during her escape 3 months ago, knowing they represented her only insurance policy against Alex's virtually unlimited resources and complete lack of moral constraints. "He'll kill Ryan just to hurt me," Victoria whispered, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd seen Alex Sterling's capacity for calculated cruelty. "And then he'll come after anyone who's helped us, anyone who knows the truth. I should never have let you get involved. I should never have put your family at risk." Jake felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling onto his shoulders, the burden of decisions that would echo through multiple lives regardless of which option he chose. He thought about Emma sleeping safely in her bed, about the quiet life they'd built together, about the promise he'd made to Sarah to keep their daughter safe from the darkness that had once defined his existence. But he also thought about Ryan's frightened eyes, about what it meant to be someone's only hope when the alternative was unthinkable. "Victoria, once we start this, there's no going back to the way things were," Jake said finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience with irrevocable choices. "If your ex-husband is as dangerous as you're telling me, tonight ends with either him in custody or all of us disappearing permanently. Are you prepared for that?" Her response came without hesitation, spoken with the fierce certainty of a mother who would sacrifice anything for her child's safety. "Then let's disappear if we have to. Just bring my son home." Jake nodded, understanding that some decisions could only be made once and lived with forever after. He activated his radio to coordinate with Wolf's approaching team, his voice steady as he began transforming from small-town mechanic back into the operator he'd once been. The approach to Bear Creek Canyon required everything Jake remembered about mountain warfare, patience, and the kind of reconnaissance that kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. He'd been moving through the terrain for over 3 hours, using natural concealment and deliberate routes to get within striking distance of the abandoned mining operation without triggering early warning systems or perimeter guards. The facility sat in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent defensive positions but limited escape routes, a tactical situation that could work for or against them depending on how events unfolded. Through his thermal scope, Jake counted vehicles and personnel, while Wolf's team established overwatch positions on the surrounding ridgelines, their presence invisible but reassuring through encrypted radio communications. What Jake saw through his optics made his blood run cold with recognition and professional concern. These weren't desperate criminals improvising a kidnapping for quick ransom money. They moved with military precision, carried professional, grade equipment, and had established overlapping fields of fire around the mining complex with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Jake recognized the setup from his overseas experience, remembering similar operations where the objective had never been negotiation or prisoner exchange, but rather the elimination of problems that couldn't be solved through legal means. Alex Sterling had never intended for Victoria or Ryan to leave this mountain alive, had probably never considered any outcome other than 2 more bodies buried in unmarked graves somewhere in the Colorado wilderness. The woman who entered looked like she'd stepped from the pages of a business magazine and taken a wrong turn into rural Colorado. Her wool coat whispered of executive boardrooms and corporate power lunches, while her designer jeans and leather boots probably cost more than most Cedar Falls residents earned in a month. The realization sent ice water through Jake's veins, followed immediately by the cold, focused fury that had carried him through his worst days in Afghanistan. Wolf, I count 12 tangos total, heavy weapons visible. They've got overwatch positions established on the high ground, he reported through his radio, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone describing weather, rather than life or death tactical situations. This isn't a prisoner exchange, it's a kill box. They're planning to eliminate everyone involved and make the bodies disappear. Wolf's acknowledgement carried the same grim understanding, along with confirmation that his team was in position to provide supporting fire when the situation deteriorated. Because in both men's experience, situations like this always deteriorated eventually. Jake's radio crackled with Victoria's nervous voice as she confirmed her approach, driving up the winding mountain road toward what both she and Alex believed would be their final confrontation. I'm 5 minutes out, she reported, her words tight with fear but steady with determination. The envelope's in the passenger seat, and I'm trying to remember everything you told me about staying alive up there. Jake's throat tightened with emotions he couldn't afford to feel. Pride and terror and admiration for a woman who was driving toward almost certain death because the alternative was abandoning her son to worse. Victoria, remember what we discussed. When things go bad, and they will, you drop flat and stay down until you hear my voice giving you the all clear. Wolf's team has your extraction route covered. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded Jake of mornings in Afghanistan when beauty and violence had existed side by side in ways that still haunted his dreams. Through his scope, he could see movement inside the main building where Ryan was being held, the boy's small form visible through thermal imaging as a bright spot of body heat in a corner that suggested he was conscious but restrained. The sight triggered protective instincts that had nothing to do with military training and everything to do with being a father himself. Someone who understood that children were never acceptable casualties regardless of the strategic situation. Jake's finger found the trigger of his rifle while he calculated wind speed, bullet drop, and the dozen factors that would determine whether precision fire could save lives or make everything worse. The sound of Victoria's car engine echoed off the canyon walls as she drove into the mining complex, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like spotlights announcing her arrival to everyone within miles. Jake watched through his scope as armed men emerged from concealment with practiced efficiency, surrounding her vehicle in patterns that blocked escape routes while maintaining clear fields of fire. Alex Sterling stepped out of the main building, his expensive suit and confident posture marking him as clearly as if he'd been wearing a target on his chest. Even at distance, Jake could see the cruelty in the man's movements, the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions and had no intention of starting now. Victoria emerged from her car with the envelope raised above her head like a white flag, her voice carrying across the canyon as she demanded to see her son before any exchange took place. Alex's response was lost in the morning wind, but his body language spoke volumes about his actual intentions as he gestured dismissively toward the building where Ryan waited. Jake's scope tracked between potential targets while he maintained radio contact with Wolf's team, everyone understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether they all went home or whether Cedar Falls would be missing some residents permanently. Ghost 7, we have positive identification on primary target, Wolf reported from his position. Recommend we initiate on your signal. But Jake's trained eyes caught the details that mattered, the way she scanned exits before making eye contact, how her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her son's hand, the telltale signs of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary. The boy beside her, maybe 6 years old, with sandy hair and intelligent eyes, wheezed with each breath in a way that triggered Jake's combat medic instincts. The confrontation below played out like a carefully choreographed dance of deception and desperation, Alex taking the envelope and examining its contents with theatrical satisfaction while his men moved into final positions around Victoria's increasingly small safe zone. Instead of releasing Ryan as any reasonable person might expect, Alex signaled to his subordinates, who began closing the trap that had been prepared from the beginning. Jake's worst fears were being confirmed in real time. Alex had never planned to honor any agreement, had never intended for this encounter to end with anything other than additional bodies to dispose of and problems permanently solved through violence rather than negotiation. "Wolf, they're moving to execute," Jake whispered into his radio, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who'd seen this pattern before and knew how it ended. "Recommend we initiate immediately before they can complete their plan." Wolf's response was immediate and professional. "Roger that, Ghost 7. All units stand by for synchronized engagement on my mark." Jake centered his scope on Alex Sterling's chest, took a deep breath to steady his aim, and prepared to do what he'd sworn he'd never do again. But then Ryan appeared in the doorway of the main building, pushed forward by one of Alex's men with a pistol pressed against the child's head, and Jake's world reduced to a single impossible equation with no good solutions. The shot had to be perfect, threading an impossible needle between saving an innocent child and avoiding the kind of collateral damage that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. Jake's training took over completely, 20 years of muscle memory and battlefield experience distilling into a moment of absolute clarity where everything except the target disappeared from his awareness. He adjusted for wind drift, atmospheric pressure, the slight tremor in his hands that came from caring too much about the outcome, and the thousand variables that separated precision from catastrophe. "Victoria, get down right now," he commanded through the radio, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never failed a mission when innocent lives hung in the balance. Everything happened simultaneously in the way that violence always seemed to compress time into impossible brevity. Victoria dropped to the rocky ground as if she'd been shot. Wolf's team opened fire from multiple positions with the coordinated precision of professionals, and Jake's rifle spoke with the final authority of justice too long delayed. Alex Sterling spun and fell, the envelope of evidence scattering across the canyon floor, while his surviving men scrambled for cover that no longer existed. Ryan broke free in the confusion, running toward his mother with the speed of pure terror transformed into desperate hope, while Jake abandoned his sniper position to provide close support in the rapidly evolving tactical situation. The firefight lasted less than 6 minutes from first shot to final silence. Professional soldiers with superior position and equipment overwhelming disorganized criminals who'd relied too heavily on intimidation and surprise. When the shooting stopped, the silence felt almost sacred, broken only by the sound of Ryan sobbing in his mother's arms and the distant wail of police sirens approaching from the valley below. Jake approached the reunited family slowly, his weapon lowered but ready, his eyes scanning automatically for any remaining threats in the growing daylight that painted everything in shades of gold and hope. Victoria looked up at Jake with tears streaming down her face. Ryan, clinging to her like a drowning person, holds a life preserver, while his young mind tried to process events that would probably require years of therapy to fully understand. "Excuse me," she said, her cultured accent carrying undertones of barely controlled panic. "My car broke down about a mile up the mountain road. My son Ryan, he's having an asthma attack. Do you know anything about breathing problems?" Jake was moving before she finished speaking, 20 years of emergency response training overriding small-town social protocols. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of months of running and hiding and pretending that safety was possible for someone with her particular collection of enemies. Jake nodded while kneeling beside them, checking Ryan for injuries with the gentle efficiency he'd learned from treating wounded children in war zones where innocence was always the first casualty. The boy was shaken but physically unharmed, his natural resilience already beginning to assert itself in the miraculous way that children sometimes recovered from trauma that would destroy adults. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as police and federal agents swarmed the mining site, their late arrival serving as a reminder that sometimes justice moved too slowly for those who needed it most urgently. Jake looked at the evidence scattered around Alex Sterling's body, at the federal agents who would spend months unraveling the criminal network Victoria had helped expose, at the mother and child who would finally be free to build a life without constantly looking over their shoulders. "Now you go home," he said simply, though both of them understood that the definition of home had probably changed permanently for everyone involved. Wherever that turns out to be, the drive back to Cedar Falls took place in contemplative silence, Ryan sleeping in the back seat with the exhausted relief of a child whose nightmares had finally ended, while Victoria stared out at the mountain landscape that had almost become their grave. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah, wondering what she would have said about his decision to risk Emma's future for the sake of strangers who'd accidentally wandered into his carefully reconstructed life. But as he watched Victoria's hand smooth Ryan's hair with infinite tenderness, he knew Sarah would have understood perfectly. Some things were worth fighting for, worth the risk, worth coming back from the dead to protect when the alternative was unthinkable. 6 months later, the sign outside Jake's garage had been updated to read Mitchell Family Auto and Security Consulting, reflecting changes that went far deeper than simple business expansion. Victoria had relocated her entire company to Colorado, establishing a major satellite office in Denver while making Cedar Falls her permanent home base for reasons that had nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with finding somewhere safe enough to let her guard down. The house next to Jake's had sold to a successful businesswoman and her young son, though everyone in town knew the real story behind their arrival and seemed determined to pretend otherwise out of respect for privacy and the kind of discretion that small communities sometimes managed better than governments. Emma and Ryan had become inseparable friends, their relationship a daily reminder that some bonds transcend blood and circumstance to create family connections that choose themselves rather than being imposed by genetics or legal documents. On crisp autumn mornings like this one, Jake often found himself watching Victoria help Emma with her science projects, while Ryan demonstrated the self-defense moves Jake had been teaching him, creating scenes of domestic normalcy that would have seemed impossible just months before. The cracked military compass that had guided him through Afghanistan now sat on the kitchen windowsill, its magnetic needle pointing steadily north toward a future none of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed in crisis and desperation. Victoria had insisted on having the compass repaired and engraved, the inscription reading, "All paths lead home," with the date of Ryan's rescue etched below in elegant script. He dropped to one knee beside the boy, his large hands gentle as he tilted the child's chin up, noting the slight blue tinge around his lips and the shallow, rapid breathing that meant minutes mattered. "Hey there, Ryan," he said in the calm voice he'd once used to comfort wounded soldiers. "We're going to get you breathing better, okay? Just look at me and try to slow down a little." Emma looked up from her homework with the kind of smile that made everything worthwhile, her question carrying the weight of hope and possibility that defined childhood at its best. "Daddy, are Victoria and Ryan going to stay with us forever?" Jake exchanged a meaningful look with Victoria, seeing his own contentment reflected in her eyes along with something deeper that neither of them had quite found words for yet. "I think they might, sweetheart," he said, pulling his daughter close while Ryan climbed into his lap with the casual confidence of a child who'd never known anything but safety and unconditional love. "I think they just might stay forever." The afternoon sun slanted through kitchen windows, illuminating a scene of domestic peace that would have seemed impossible during those dark hours in Bear Creek Canyon. Jake Mitchell had gone to war as an idealistic young man, come home as a damaged soldier carrying invisible wounds, and somehow found his way to becoming exactly who he was meant to be all along. Not Ghost 7, not the broken veteran who'd lost his wife to cancer, but simply a father who'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought for other people's children. And sometimes, if the universe decided to be particularly generous, saving others turned out to be the same thing as saving yourself.